Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hey everyone, welcome to today's episode, and this episode is based on a question from a listener. This is Karl from Norway, who is a member of the Knowlton's Rangers, the membership program from History Unplugged. And if you're at the highest level of the membership program, you can ask me a question, and I guarantee I will answer it, and this is one of those questions. All right, here's what Karl asks. What is the greatest extent of classical European reach, and how do they affect or influence the culture of the known world in that period? All right, well, thanks, Karl. That's a big question. First of all, I love looking at travelers and explorers in the ancient world, the medieval world, basically any time before you get to the age of steamships and railroads. That's because travel is very hard. You're at the mercy of the weather. If you're going on sail ship, you could be stranded in a port city for weeks or months until the weather clears up and you can start traveling again. And also, culture is a lot more fractured, and you only have to travel a few hundred miles before languages can change dramatically, cultures can change dramatically, and you have almost no idea what you're getting into. If you're Marco Polo and you're going along the Silk Road, your knowledge could be based on Roman-era geographies, and you have no idea if you're going into unknown lands where mythological creatures exist, or people who walk on their hands or have dog heads go around. It sounds ridiculous, but when you have nothing but basically hearsay to go off of in these unknown lands, you have no idea what to expect. But there's another reason I'm interested in this question, and that's because there is simply so much we don't know about who traveled where in the ancient world. We do have some accounts from travel writers like Herodotus, the Greek writer who goes to Egypt, he goes to Babylon, and many other places. We have famously Marco Polo. But for every one of these people, there are probably dozens, if not hundreds of other traders who simply didn't leave behind an account, or if they did, the account didn't survive. We have enough scraps and pieces of information to know that there is a lot that we do not know. We have accounts from Carthaginian naval fleets that travel around Africa, something that ancient Carthage circumnavigated Africa. We're constantly finding archaeological remains of civilizations who are in places that we don't think should be there. I did an episode on European explorers who arrived in the New World before Columbus. There's evidence of Chinese ruins in the New World. Some people think there are ancient Phoenician ruins in the New World. So the point being is that where written sources don't tell us the story, we have to piece together the rest of the picture as best we can. A lot of that comes from archaeological findings where we find, let's say, Roman jewelry or Roman ceramics that are in places very far away from where we would expect such goods to be found. And that shows the extent of trade that's happening and taking place. And it shows that there's some sort of globalization happening thousands and thousands of years ago, before we get into the real era of globalization in the 19th and 20th centuries, when you have oceanic trade and goods freely flowing back and forth between the West and the East and everywhere in between. All right, so let me go way back, and for this episode, I'm going to be relying on a wonderful book called Travel in the Ancient World. It was written in the 70s by a classicist, Lionel Casson. And he relies on a lot of Greek and Roman sources to show what was it like to go to an inn in the Roman Empire. If you were going to a Greek religious festival, how would you travel there? What would your lodgings be like? It's a very good, straightforward book with a lot of facts. I recommend it, and I'm going to be drawing upon it. First, I want to paint a picture of what it was like before Western civilization, or as a shorthand, I'll use Greek civilization, what it was like in the world before it really had that much of a reach. I'm going to use the travels of Herodotus as an example. Herodotus was born in 485 BCE, or BC, depending on which term you like, and he traveled before the Hellenistic Age, before Alexander the Great's conquest brought Greek civilization throughout a lot of the Near East. We hear the term Hellenistic civilization, and we don't really know what that means, but one idea is that Greek becomes an important lingua franca, a language used in trade and commerce among many different people. And there's a common Greek that develops called Koine Greek that's not any particular dialect of Greek. But before Alexander the Great's period, Greek was just a provincial language and it didn't get you very far. So here's what Herodotus went up against. He reported that when he was in Egypt, Egyptians were the first to say that the soul, when the body has died, enters some other creature, each at the moment of birth, and after making the rounds of every form of animal, fish, and bird, re-enters a newborn human body. But Egyptologists found out that Herodotus was totally wrong. In the time of Herodotus, Egyptians still believed that all good men at death became Osiris, the god who had been killed by a wicked brother, but that lived on forever in another world. How did Herodotus get this wrong? Well, when he was in Egypt, he was relying on an interpreter, and his interpreter probably couldn't handle Herodotus's questions about Egyptian religion. Or maybe he was looking at hieroglyphs and misunderstanding what he was seeing. Herodotus probably got his information wherever he was traveling from the people that tourists generally come in contact with. The drivers, porters, waiters, maids, and anyone he came in contact that might have had a bit of a smattering of Greek. So maybe he talked in Pidgin Greek or Pidgin Egyptian, crude sign language, and this is why in his travel accounts he gets a lot of facts wrong. I talked in an earlier episode where Herodotus describes Sumerian temple practices where basically all women had to prostitute themselves, and that's something else that's incorrect. Well, if you've ever traveled to a foreign country and you think you understood what a local said to you, but you found out later that you completely misunderstood it, as I have many times, those are the challenges that Herodotus ran up against when Greek influence hadn't gone very far. If you jump forward to the 300s BC, this is after Alexander the Great. This is after his daughter states control the entire Near Eastern world. You have the Ptolemies in Egypt. You have the Seleucid Empire. You have all these other empires. And the Hellenized world became an integral part of the Mediterranean Greek world west of it. If you go to the far west, Carthage still ruled the seas, and they didn't allow anyone to pass the Straits of Gibraltar, partly because they had a monopoly on the trade of tin that was in England, and they didn't want anyone else to find the source of it. But east of Carthage, the world had been Hellenized all the way to Babylon. Herodotus would have had no such language problems if he traveled his same route. Greek could take you anywhere, and now there was a Koine, or common tongue Greek, which stitched together all the different dialects. There were new port cities that sprang up to handle the increased sea traffic. Antioch developed at this time, and it was founded by the Seleucids in 300 BC. Alexandria was established in around 331 BC, and the Ptolemies made it their capital and turned it into probably one of the greatest centers of learning in the classical world. And from either port city, you could book passage on freighters that sailed over open water to Syracuse, and from there all the way to Marseille. So the Mediterranean was bound together as it had never been before by language, trade, and a similar type of culture. Now this is where, to get to Karl's original question, where you start to see Western civilization really push outward. We know about the Alexandrian conquest and Hellenization, but there were also moves to the west. In around 300 BC, a man named Pytheas sailed from Marseille through the Straits of Gibraltar and managed to slip through the Carthaginian blockade and was able to reach the Atlantic. We don't know what motivated him to go on this trip. Maybe he was searching for the secret that Carthaginian merchants were keeping to themselves, their source of tin that allowed them to produce bronze, which they shipped into the Mediterranean. Well, he was successful. He made a number of observations of the sun, which allowed later geographers to calculate parallels of latitude, and he investigated and reported on tin mines of Cornwall. He visited Britain and circumnavigated the entire island. He fixed the positions of Ireland, and he also described that he went to an island of Thule, whatever that is, which he said was 6 days north of Britain and 1 day south of the, quote, frozen sea, where the sun went down for only 2 or 3 hours at night. And there's been a lot of debate about what Thule was. Could it have been Iceland, or was it part of Norway? Well, here's another important voyage of exploration that happened 2 centuries later, and this happened at the other end of the world. This journey was done by a man named Eudoxus, who was born in a city on the Sea of Marmara. His backer, Ptolemy VIII, was interested in breaking into the rich trade that flowed from India and Arabia to the Greek world. This is because whatever Indian spices and Arabian incense came to the Mediterranean by water traveled in Indian and Arab ships as far as the Red Sea, and then they went overland north to Egypt. Indian and Arab shippers wanted to keep it this way because if they had a monopoly on the trade route, they could keep the profits to themselves. Well, Eudoxus and his backer wanted to find an alternate route. He happened to be in Alexandria in 120 BC when a half-drowned sailor was brought to the Ptolemaic court. He was nursed back to health and taught Greek, and he gave the story that he was an Indian, a sole survivor of his crew, and he offered to prove it by showing his way back to his home to anyone the king picked. He may have been a Tamil-speaking native of southern India, where Greeks rarely went, since if he had come from the north, there would have been plenty of interpreters available, since Alexander had brought the Indus Valley within the Greek orbit. So northwest India by this time was fairly familiar to the Greeks. After Alexander conquered up to the Punjab, his successors had maintained petty kingdoms for a while. Some of their expeditions had penetrated as far south as Bombay and as far east as Patna. The Greeks knew of the Ganges River, the Himalayas, and of the island of Sri Lanka. But the only way they were able to get there was the way Alexander had, through that terribly long land route, with the exhausting climb through the mountain barrier that closed off India on the northwest. Arab traders controlled the coastal waters of the Indian Ocean and much of the Red Sea, and closed the Greeks out as effectively as the Carthaginians did in the western Mediterranean. They and their Indian colleagues also kept to themselves the secret of India's monsoons. From May to September, the winds blew steadily from the southwest, and a ship can leave the mouth of the Red Sea, stand off the coast of Arabia, and then strike across open water. And the blustery southwest monsoon, coming over the starboard quarter, will carry him directly to India. By delaying his return until any time between November and March, when the monsoon shifts to exactly the reverse direction, blowing from the northwest, he can make the voyage back just as quickly. Indian and Arab sea merchants had been shuttling back and forth away for centuries, bringing pepper, cinnamon, nard, and other Indian spices this way. And they had such a monopoly that the Greeks believed that some of these products originated in Arabia, which wasn't true because Arab traders were just middlemen in the trade. Eudoxus, with his resuscitated Indian sailor, knowledgeable in the ways of the monsoon to guide him over open water, made 2 voyages from the Red Sea to India, and he returned safely each time, and each time had the cargo of spices he was carrying confiscated by Ptolemy's custom officials. So he decided to reach India by sailing in the other direction around Africa, and in that way bypassing the king's agents. He got together an expedition, but made it only as far as the Atlantic coast of Morocco, where a mutiny turned him back. He fitted out a second expedition, he set off, and he was never heard from again. So as we can see, there are different Greek figures that try to strike out and engage in trade and bring parts of their culture with them well beyond the confines of the Western world. But what really made contacts between the West, or Europe, and the rest of the world happen was the consolidation of the Roman Empire. For the first and last time in history, the Mediterranean was politically and culturally one world. After unification under one ruler, there was about 200 years of peace. The Roman emperors, with their revenues and manpower, were able to build up offensive forts and garrisons, and in some places continuous walls, which sort of roped off the empire from outside incursions. A permanent navy was founded with units based on strategic points around the Mediterranean, and it wiped out the perennial scourge of piracy from the water. The first 2 centuries in the modern era were golden days for a traveler or a trader. A traveler could make his way from the shores of the Euphrates to the border between England and Scotland without crossing a foreign frontier. He could travel on Roman roads and was always within the bounds of one government's jurisdiction. Roman coins was the only kind he had to carry, and they were accepted and could be changed everywhere. He could sail through waters without fear of pirates, and a planned network of good roads gave him access to all major urban centers, and the routes were policed well enough for him to ride them with little fear of bandits. You only needed 2 languages. Greek could take you from Mesopotamia to Yugoslavia, and Latin could take you from Yugoslavia to Britain. Wherever you were under the protective umbrella of an efficient legal system. If a Roman citizen got into trouble, he could insist upon trial at Rome, as Paul did. If he was not a citizen, Rome permitted him to be tried under his own native law, and there were special courts to handle cases where different native codes were involved. So what were the factors that drove trade in Rome? According to the Ancient History Encyclopedia, a mix of state control and a free market approach ensured goods produced in one location could be exported far and wide. Cereals, wine, and olive oil were exported in huge quantities.